This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. More than 1 in 5 New Yorkers, 1.6 million, are poor. 46 million Americans live below the poverty line, the highest number in the 52 years that the census has been counting. The poverty level in Manhattan is the same as rural Mississippi, and the Bronx is the poorest urban area in the country. There is a growing class of poor and permanently unemployed, but many Americans and public officials and presidential wannabes just don't know or care. Joining us to talk about poverty, the poor, politics, and public policy is someone who does care. David Jones, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Community Service Society of New York. CSS is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization that promotes economic advancement and full civic participation for low-income New Yorkers. Mr. Jones' articles can be read in the New York Amsterdam News and El Diario La Prensa and on the Huffington Post website. Welcome, David. It's a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure.
Bad news, tough times.
Yeah, I think the news is bad because obviously people don't seem to get that we're still in the midst of the worst recession of our lifetime. And it's had a profound impact on New Yorkers. And yet, it doesn't resonate. If you read the press, if you read even as people start to launch for mayor, there's not much attention to this issue.
Why? Why this disconnect? Why this ignorance, if you will?
I think a couple of things. Obviously, the way campaigns are financed don't rely on the poor. They expect to pull the poor who vote out. But the way we've started to finance our campaigns has very little to do with ordinary Americans or New Yorkers, and the costs of running a campaign have become so huge that it sort of pushes this to the last issue. For instance, in the conversations I've had throughout the city, I hear more concern about the interests of how business is going to do in New York, how small businesses might be hurt, rather than what about people who are the working poor, and we are talking working poor. We have this image of, poor people laying around, watching television and not doing anything. That's not the picture of working poor that I've seen in New York.
And also, it's a declining, squeezed middle class that's moving into the working class. Absolutely. And their sons and daughters into the unemployed.
Well, there was an article recently, many of your viewers may have seen, in the Times by Krugman, talking about the fact that looking at the class of college graduates this past year, 50% couldn't find work, and of those who did find work, many were forced to take jobs in low-wage work. In other words, go to 4 years, spend all the money it takes, do all the work, do everything you're supposed to do as an American as you're trying to get ahead, and still end up, not being able to get adequate work or work at all.
Well, there seems to be a dissolution of the social contract. If you listen to the rhetoric of our putative political leaders, that there doesn't need to be a concern for the less fortunate, that money equals morals to a certain extent.
Well, I think that is true, and that's why I think we have a fight on our hands. I don't give up and despair here. This country goes through a variety of sort of ins and outs as we go, and I talk to some of my younger staff. This is going to be for a long haul. There are structural reasons how we got here. There were all sorts of assumptions made about everything from education to what was really causing people to be poor that have become ingrained in the sort of the popular culture. And we're going to have perhaps decades of fight to start to reverse this.
We're getting old for decades.
I know. Well, that's why I hope another generation takes this up, and there are.
Okay, you wrote a piece in January in City Limits titled New U.S. Reality, a Permanent Class of Underemployed. Talk about this dystopian future, if you will, or dystopian present.
We started in this almost 5 or 6 years ago. We did a research piece on labor participation rates for black men in New York. And we actually got a number that we said was impossible. Basically, around 50% of African American males who were of working age were not working. And we immediately said that couldn't be true. As a matter of fact, when we brought it to the New York Times, they sent in their own team to disaggregate what was going on. And that's led down a road of really looking at the problem of work and the poverty. Because what we started to find was, yes, part of that were young people who didn't have a credential. They didn't get a high school diploma. That was one group that just weren't connecting with the world of work. But there was more problems here. There was the problem basically of deciding to incarcerate so many, particularly African American and Latino young men. We were up to about 63,000 when I was last looking, with 23,000 on parole, with the finding that basically once that happened to you, you suffered a kind of civil death. You never worked again. That was it. You basically had to prey upon your own communities.
But it's not only blacks and Latinos.
Oh, no.
I mean, that focus ignores huge numbers of whites and Asians.
And
for
I
that
think
matter.
that's what we recognized as part of the difficulty. I think the sort of political problem we've gotten, and this is, I have to talk about my own sort of advocacy group. We've made this an African American and Latino issue. It's not. It's an American issue now. We have and that's what we started to come up with. When we started to look, for instance, on the issue of disconnected youth, we have 173,000 of them in 2009. That's 16 to 24-year-olds who are neither in work or in school. I said, boy, that's really terrible for blacks and Latinos. There were nearly 6 million across the country, and most of them were not black and Latino. Most of them were the kids hanging out in the malls in suburban communities who didn't get a credential, didn't get skills. All over America, you have this enormous growing body of young people who are missing the boat in terms of participation in the economy.
So you need to create, advocates need to create a counter narrative, because that's not the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative is that the poor are concentrated in the cities and they're black and Hispanic.
And it's self-inflicted.
And it's self-inflicted.
They
Well,
listen to too much hip-hop music. Their parents don't care. I mean, I've sat through more hearings, and it's become
even
legitimate.
though there are cultural elements. to
Sure
some of
there
this.
are,
Right.
but every group, I mean, any more than the description of the Irish as always drinking, I mean, all this stuff is crap. When you start to generalize for a whole people, any people, it becomes a distortion of the truth. Essentially, when you meet young people across the board, they want a future, they want to work hard. I found very rarely anyone says, oh, I just want to hang around. So.
Everyone, yeah, every once in
I-
a while. But
yeah,
you know, I'm
agree with
almost
that.
tempted as I get
Yes,
older,
I
but
know.
no, not quite. Okay, but the poor have not been part of the political electoral conversation for a long time. If you went back to the 2008 election, I don't think the word poor or the word poverty was uttered by any of the presidential candidates.
They avoid it like the plague. I have to give credit, actually, to Mayor Bloomberg, who I've had a lot of difficulties with and differences with. He was the one who started talking, we have to have a special initiative to talk about poverty. And he'll try to fix it. While he hasn't fixed it, I don't see another mayor anywhere talking about poverty as a central concern. And we have to. Ultimately, this country is going to hit this shoal, already has hit the shoal, because the problems that are going to be engendered by leaving this ever larger group of young people and not so young people who really don't have any connection to work and really are permanently sort of surplus labor, as one commentator has discussed, which is already present in Europe, and they've had a discussion about that.
And then Mayor Bloomberg talked about that.
But we're approaching 18 to 20% potentially of working age people being totally unconnected with the world of work. That's like an unexploded bomb in the American culture from all sorts of venues. It's an unexploded bomb for rising rates of crime. We know that methamphetamine growth has been exponential, far exceeds what's happening in inner cities, because people are sitting around, no work, methamphetamine, both as a way to get some money and to avoid the reality, is becoming more and more common. You have this fringe political stuff. I think the Tea Party stuff, in part, is a whole generation looking at their kids and what happened to them and wanting someone to blame. That this wasn't the American dream. I worked really hard. I did everything they told me I was supposed to do. Sure, I didn't go to some fancy college, but I'm willing to work, and it's not working. And the trouble is, people take that two-way. They don't see this as a disinvestment from working class people and middle class people and adequate education.
And the destruction of unions, etc.
They scapegoat. Oh, this is because the immigrants did it to me. This is because all those blacks and Latinos are sucking up all the money and not working as hard as I am. And that diversion is going to lead to a political crisis, which will make the party discussion we're watching now in the Republican primaries look like nothing, because it leads to extremism. We've been down this road before, fellow Americans, when we watched what happened in Germany. And that's what I'm afraid of.
Wow.
Well, that's exactly what you can't leave this many people just hanging around. No hope, no work, watching everything they built over generations fall apart and expect it to turn out good. That people will suddenly come together and say, well, I'm going to work together so we end class inequality. Generally, you lead to fringe elements starting to take over the dialogue. And that's what I think we're seeing happening. And that's why this becomes, if I'm a businessman sitting there with a multinational, I got to be very concerned that if this process continues this way, with income inequality continuing to grow, I'm not going to say this is instant, but we start to sort of shatter the social contract, and it has consequences.
Okay, so you're telling me that Sinclair Lewis was wrong in his title, if not in the novel itself, that it can happen here?
Of course it can. I mean, let's be straight. People under stress do all sorts of things. And that's what they don't seem to understand. You cannot let this many people with no hope, and I'm not talking blacks and Latinos now, I'm talking American working people, have to have a better dialogue.
Okay, this may sound like an elitist asking the question, but why don't large numbers of Americans who are in this particular situation, in a sense, understand it and react to it? They're sidetracked by these other issues.
Well, it's clearly, we'll read our press. I'm sorry. I don't want to criticize my tabloids. The press is in some ways fueling a perception of almost making these issues like they're easy, making their issues that working people don't have to be concerned about the end of unionization. There are attacks now that unions are the root of all evil, that basically that's the reason America isn't moving forward. There's a weird discussion going on now that is actually against the interests of most of the readers of many of the tabloids in New York. And I think the information flow of what people have, and also the appeal to prejudice, just like in the South, where they were consciously able to divide the sharecropping white community and say, well, your real problem is all this civil rights for colored. And they diverted this whole community onto race as opposed to the real critical issues and self-interest.
He who defines the issues wins the war.
And I don't want to give this impression that this is the end of the world. This is a fight that we, as sort of the closing days of us as a generation, and the new generation is going to have to take on. I don't think anyone's going to be able to ignore it.
Okay. How do you change the narrative? How do you frame the discussion? How do you generate and galvanize support for this multiracial, in effect, multi-class effort?
Well, some of the efforts are very traditional. I mean, CSS has started to consciously work more closely with the union movement in the city of New York. That hasn't happened with not-for-profits, and we can, at some other point, we can describe why. But clearly, particularly unions that are organizing low-wage workers are vital. You can't stand alone as a low-wage worker, and we did a report on this for security guards, which was an eye-opener for me. I've been at this 25 years, and I don't claim to have understood this stuff from the beginning, I'll tell you. But when we did the security guards report, we found there's 63,000 security guards in the city of New York. At that time, before the efforts of unionization, I think there were 2,000 or 3,000 who were unionized. They were earning $10 an hour, no health insurance, no ability. If they complained, they were terminated because 7 or 8 people were waiting or more were waiting for this job. But actually, when the Krugman piece came out, I recognized that there's a shift going on here that is just as profound. The Krugman piece was talking about college guys not finding work.
Right.
I went back to that report, which was already 6 or 7 years out of date, and looked at the college attainment level. Essentially at that time, 26% of security guards earning $10 an hour had a BA or some college.
Wow.
Now, we looked again, 50% have some college or a BA. This is a low-wage safety net job. Still doesn't provide enough, even when unionized, to really support a family. Suddenly, I have a whole generation of people who see this as the best they can do. And that's creating its own kind of dynamic. I think we are trying to reopen a discussion on unionization to protect basic rights for workers. Paid sick leave is a big deal for us.
We want to talk about paid sick leave. We want to talk about prevailing
living wage. You know, the whole business has to be done. But we're also looking at the question of, even with the existing resources, we're clearly not looking at our education system in the right way. If I keep generating this, we have a 50%, 55% graduation rate for, for African Americans, for blacks and Latinos, which is, despite all the reform, is horrendous.
Right.
Well, you got more than 1 million young people in the system. That's incredible.
And also, some of the people who are graduating aren't ready for college and community college.
Well,
we teach them.
Right. So the question is, are we looking at the right part of the education system? Your viewers may have seen the recent article on Stuyvesant High School. 40 African Americans and Latinos out of a class of 3,000 something or other. And essentially, they didn't even mention gender. I don't think there are any guys at all. But we've invested as a society, and this is us, and certainly the way I've treated my children, the notion that the real investment should only be at the very top tier. That our specialized schools with kids going on for Nobel or high-level jobs are really the only important part of the education system. In doing so, we've left New York City as perhaps the worst in the nation in career and technical education.
Not only New York City. I mean, I was on a New Jersey school board where everybody wanted to close the shops, close down the tech.
So I think when we did a poll some years ago through our Unheard Third, which is the largest poll of low-income people in the nation that we know about, we asked what they thought would be the major investment in schools that would really help them and their families. And it came back consistent with almost everybody. Smaller class size, much better teaching. The third, however, was a focus on career and technical education. Now, this was a shock for me. I came out of a generation where my father hadn't been allowed to touch tools for fear that he would become a tradesman or a craftsman. He had to go on to law school and sort of, I am my son's child, I'm my father's son, and I did it in lockstep. And I found that we began to become so fixated on the issue of the talented 10, the very elite, which led to Barack Obama and many others, great leaders of America. We forgot about the base, because the base of my own Crown Heights, Bedford-Stuyvesant, is in some ways worse than it was in the 1950s in terms of their access to a middle-class income. Essentially, then, in those days, to drop out of high school was not the end of the world. Though I do remember a funny story with my sister being among the first African Americans to go to Hunter and having failed a Latin test. And my parents sat her down and said, "It's time for you to go to work." The scream that went out, I've never heard anything like it. I failed everything, and she was always angry at me. He fails, you don't take him and tell him you're going to force him to go to work. But the notion was not so foreign. They weren't going to do it. They were scaring the But the notion of going to work and making your way was not impossible in the 50s and 60s. Now, it really is not possible anymore.
Okay. Do we, the society, have the tools to effectively address the problems of the poor and the working class and the middle class becoming working class and poor?
I think we have some of the tools. And remember, I think that was the interesting engagement with the Merrill Commission. We do have things that we're already pumping out, for instance, in our educational system, enormous amounts of dollars that supposedly go to career and technical education. No standards up until now, no real hard look at how this could be made the finest system. I'm not talking about new money. I'm just talking about let's use the resources we have. And I think we're going to have to start doing that kind of thing. For instance, are we looking properly at everything from unemployment insurance? We're looking at at least a couple of examples in other states of using unemployment insurance, which is now at 99 weeks, as a wage subsidy.
Explain.
Well, essentially, I've been out of work 6 months. This is getting grim. I now go into employers, and they said, I don't know, you've been out of work for a long time. The notion is, if I still have my unemployment insurance, I could voluntarily say, look, I'll pay essentially 50% of my wage if you'll provide certain guarantees that if I successfully meet the requirements, I'm going to become a permanent employee. It has a dual potential impact. It allows, obviously, smaller employers particularly, who are at small margins, to get productivity during this, hopefully, end of a recession, get them through the bottom, and then take off and get skilled workers. It has all sorts of problems.
I was going to say there are a lot of practical problems, but at least, a little thinking outside the box.
Have to start thinking about it rather than taking it.
Okay, let's move to some of the stuff that's almost thinking within the box that you referred to earlier. Paid sick leave, prevailing or fair wages, living wage, New York City. Talk about New York City.
Well, I think this has been one of the failings of vision here. Basically, we have a city of poor people who are the working poor, those that have work. Mm-hmm. And when you start to talk to them close up, this is really unacceptable in terms of what they're up against. The fact that many of them don't have health insurance in the first place. But then the problem, because we have so many single families, single parent families, where young women are working full time and over full time and trying to take care of a child at the same time. And being told by the city or some of the city that no, we're not going to support paid sick leave. It's already been in San Francisco, Connecticut is taking it up, Washington, D.C. In New York City, every time we try to pass a paid sick leave idea, the hands go up. This is going to be the end of business in New York. It's never been shown. There's no data to show that. But
whenever there is data, that's dueling data.
Yeah, when we poll, about 50 to 60% of low-wage workers say they don't have paid sick leave. And overwhelmingly, they came back. What do they do when they're sick? They go to work sick. Because what choice do you have? You lose a day's, if I'm working at essentially McDonald's or White Castle or the rest, if I'm off, they said, if you have a nice employer, sorry, Ms. Rodriguez, you just don't get paid. You weren't here. That's a nice employer. If a not nice employer, your kid was sick with asthma, 2 days, you're out of here.
What are we talking about? How many days are we talking about?
Talking about 5 or 6 days for the whole year.
What's the odd? Be a little political prognosticator here. What are the odds of this getting through the council and a mayor?
I've told my people who are working on this issue will ultimately be won. We have to keep pushing every poll data that comes out, asking ordinary people, well, what do they think about providing paid sick leave for workers in the city of New York? And they say overwhelmingly, the numbers are incredible, 90% say, yeah, they support that because they know the realities. How can you be asking at a fast food restaurant, someone working on your burger who's got the flu? What kind of insanity is that? Or in the back kitchen at Lutece, I'm not saying Lutece doesn't have paid, essentially coughing all over your food. You don't see that. The fancy waiter, college educated generally, but who's washing the dishes in the back and contaminating?
Okay, you've made the case for it. I'm asking the political question, is it going to happen?
We're going to try to do the best we can.
Okay.
But we have to recognize that the pushback from essentially business is enormous. And when you dig through it, they try to make this, we're concerned with small businesses. The bill has been watered down for small businesses. This is about fast food. These conglomerates that are running fast food operations are putting a lot of money out there to support. And basically, they're the ones who are the principal offenders here.
Okay, let's talk about living wage, and then in the close, I want some more fire and brimstone from you.
Well, the living wage is another example of this. We recognize that by not paying adequate wage to city workers who get government subsidy, this is not, we're going to go out and force everyone to pay the same wage. Living wage, if you're getting government money, taxpayer money for stuff, you should at least pay a minimum wage that can make for something that could at least approximate not even a decent, it's $11 an hour, some craziness like that, which with no apartments available for under 500, it's insane. But anyway, it's a first step towards that. And again, we're getting this pushback. This is a job killer because we're in a recession. This is very nice if we're in full employment. But what they're doing, whether people recognize it or not, by refusing to do this, they're forcing these costs onto the taxpayers. Because what do? You show up. You can't find housing. You show up paying some ungodly amount of money in a homeless shelter that the taxpayer bears. All this is cost shifting. And it's cost shifting from business, which is basically doing fairly well in the city of New York, and not small business, onto the taxpayer. And also really destroying the ability of people to...
Okay, last minute.
Okay.
A year from now, you're sitting across from me. What are your hopes and expectations in the city and the nation?
In the nation, I hope we have a serious dialogue going on. And I don't want it perfect on what we're going to do about jobs for the working poor across the nation. Whether that's a return to some kind of CETA program that, essentially those marginalized kids, I don't care if they're purple, green, or whatever, have a shot to keep connection to work. They're not going to be making a lot of money, but at least a chance to go through and start getting credentials that they'll need to participate and compete against China, India, and the rest of the world.
Okay,
and we have consensus.
New York.
New York, obviously, will be coming into a new mayor. I'm not partisan. Hopefully a mayor that recognizes that the working poor are an essential part of the city, that we're going to provide adequate supports for people who are working hard, that we're going to restructure our educational system to recognize that you can't just throw away young people who aren't on track to Stuyvesant Bronx High School, but are also creating a world-class aviation high school, a world-class automotive high school.
World-class plumbing and electrical.
Or when you come up with a Cornell Metrotech Center, you start to identify kids in the middle of Brownsville and the South Bronx who are going to be in junior school, middle school, suddenly on track to get into that school rather than to just be marginalized sweeping the floors.
Okay, so you're coming back next March and we'll see how good you are. We'll play this back.
I'll be here.
Okay.
I'm not going anywhere.
My thanks to David Jones for being on the show. For more information about CSS of New York, check out their website, cssny.org. Join us next week when my guest will be Sam Schwartz, a.k.a. Gridlock Sam, here on CUNY TV. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.